We're going to talk about Confucius now. Confucius is the name by which you know this figure. The Chinese name would be Confucius. Confucius is a Latinization of that. Early Western scholars like to Latinize the names, that is, re-represent as if they were Latin words, the names of Chinese thinkers. Someone quipped in the 20th century, if we still did that, Mao Zedong would be called Mautius. So Confucius, I'll use the name Confucius because that's the name by which most of us know him. The name was Confucius. We know him primarily through a collection of sayings that are known as the Analects. Okay. There are secondary accounts of his life and character and so forth, so we have corroboration of some things. The Analects present a very interesting archaeological problem. There is to this day tremendous debate about how old various layers of the Analects are. It's pretty much a certainty they've been reinterpreted, tinkered with, and so forth. Some things excised, some things added, then the excised things rediscovered, re-added, and whatever. It's an ongoing problem. So we do the best we can. One of my own professors in graduate school, Panyat Buchvarov, is very, very much respected as a philosopher's philosopher. He used to, in instances where we just could not nail things down with certainty, he'd take a few puffs on his cigar and he'd say, well, the best we can do is the best we can do. Which is true. You usually add to that, so we damn well better do it. Well, also true. So, okay, Confucius is, as I mentioned in the lecture on the I Ching, is interpreting these principles that the I Ching interprets for us. He's interpreting them primarily as regards humanity, our individual integrity, our relationships with other human beings, our social relationships. In other words, turning those principles about primal relationships, relationships that lead to advancement and those that lead to dissolution, interpreting those with focus on the human realm. Okay? What about humanity? Well, if we're going to understand relationships, we're going to understand how the world works, we're going to be able to promote the stability and the vitality of human society. Stability is not by itself a goal. Okay? This is something that I think perplexes, or let's say, is a major issue for the current government of China. Above all, you want order. But you know what? You can have order and absolutely drain the life out of your people, in which case you don't have prosperity, you don't have a flourishing of the culture. And if you emphasize the vitality of the people, you may end up destabilizing society. Every society, has that problem. If you opt simply for stability, forgetting about vitality, then essentially living as a human being is more of a sentence than it is a blessing. Okay? I have a friend who grew up in the Soviet Union who used to, basically talk about it in these, terms similar to this and say that the problem was that, it just felt like the Soviet Union was so stable it was never going to go away, but that was not a source of comfort, that was a source of hopelessness because there was no vitality. Okay? Well, for Confucius, these two have to be in balance, stability and vitality. Okay? Order and change. The whole yin and yang of it, that has to be in balance. Okay? That is what allows human beings to flourish and to live well in the world and to live well with each other. How do you achieve that? Confucius thought primarily through education. Education. Now, what is that going to consist of? Well, not merely literature and the arts such as painting and poetry and so forth, but also music. He believed that music could do a great deal to inspire and to cultivate character, a belief by the way that he shared in common with Plato. Etiquette, Yes, etiquette. Well, why on earth would you emphasize etiquette so much? I like to tell a story from the 1990s about a syndicated columnist who went by the name Miss Manners. She had a syndicated column that was in many, many, many different newspapers, and she finally wrote a book called Miss Manners Saves Western Civilization. Okay. In the preface to the book, she said, obviously the title is an overstatement and meant as a bit of a joke, but on the other hand, there's something dead serious about that. The breakdown of mutual respect, the breakdown of mutual regard, the breakdown of empathy in our society makes it impossible to make any progress in society. You want to fight crime, you want to raise the level of culture, you want to encourage education, you want achievement and so forth. You know what? We have to begin by respecting each other. If we can't even manage to get to work and to get home or to move in the supermarket or whatever without acting in a way that amounts to sort of a low-level road rage, how can we possibly live together and flourish together as a people? And she said, etiquette is not knowing about which fork to use. Etiquette is a matter of acting as if the feelings of other people matter. And I thought that summed up very nicely, and I also thought that was a very Confucian observation. The current government of China has started reopening Confucian schools. During the Cultural Revolution, in the formative years of communist China, the Confucian schools were shut down because they were seen as a last hanging on of feudalism and obsolete ways of thinking. What Beijing has realized in the past few decades is, you know what, we are not teaching character and integrity and mutual responsibility and these sorts of things to our young people, and it's having an unexpected and undesirable consequence. So what should we do? Let's draw upon our own traditions. Let's reopen the Confucian schools and start teaching them Confucian ethics again. Okay, so interesting story about music. There's a proverbial tale about Confucius that he heard on one occasion flute music that was so moving, so beautiful, that for 6 months thereafter he could not bring himself to eat meat. Well, what sense does that make? What it makes is, you're hearing flute music, it reminds you of birds. Okay? And if it's reminding you of birds and you're so moved by the beauty of bird songs, that may strike a sympathetic, empathetic chord in you that you're very reluctant to sit down and eat a bird. And that could expand to other non-human animals as well. Okay? In other words, at what point should your empathy stop? Well, it should at least include other human beings, but there's no clear indication that it should stop anywhere. So, the individual and the group must be elevated together. You cannot simply educate individuals to have integrity and then have them go out into corrupt institutions and expect that they're going to be able to accomplish anything. Plato raises that saying. I keep drawing parallels to Plato, but that's because with Chinese culture they are sometimes so dramatic. You can't be a just person living in an unjust society and hope that you're going to achieve justice in your life, because guess what? You're just participating in that society. You are helping to subsidize and to promote injustices, perhaps even unwittingly. Well, Confucius had that same sort of revelation. You have to reform individuals, but you also have to reform institutions as well. The things we do individually and the things we do collectively have to be simultaneously reformed. And both will be reformed by education, and both will be elevated. If I make the institutions better, that will help individuals to behave better. If I make individuals better, that will help to reform the institutions. But they have to work together. Okay? You can't have it just one way. I'm going to be a good individual no matter how bad society is. Well, you're going to have to live in that society. You're not going to come out with clean hands if you don't pay some attention to that. Or I'm just going to reform the institutions, and guess what? And that's what Beijing realized recently. We have reformed institutions, and guess what? We didn't bother to reform individuals who are now going to fill those institutions, and we have a problem. Okay? Both must be done simultaneously. Best way to educate is by personal example. Recently, a number of my friends in India have been very vocal about the growing awareness of the problem of violent rape in India, and calling upon the government to take measures to control this problem. And many of them agree the best way, one of the best ways, let's say, one of the best ways to reduce the occurrence of rape is to teach your sons to respect women. And one of the best ways to teach your sons to respect women is by example. Respect them yourself. Be that role model. Okay? And that's similar to the kind of thing that Confucius had in mind. If I'm chiding you to be better, and I'm not being better myself, you're not going to take it seriously. I have to show you by example that it is possible and that it is desirable, and what living with empathy and respect would look like. Okay? That leads to a kind of classlessness. How is that possible? Well, if we all have integrity, and if we are all maintaining the integrity of the institutions that we live in, whether it's business, politics, whatever, then we don't have to worry about who's above who else. It's not a matter of someone superior to me is going to keep me in line. No, we are managing our lives properly so that we are all flourishing. Class becomes a more of ceremonial function. Confucius said that in a virtuous society, the king would only have a ceremonial function. Okay, lead the ceremonies on national holidays and so forth, but you would not need the king to manage your affairs because the people are managing their own affairs. Okay, well, if you're going to say, okay, I'm going to let the people manage their own affairs without any supervision from above, you better be awfully sure that the people are actually going to do that with integrity. And Confucius is aware of, okay, without achieving that kind of social integrity, there has to be controls, but the controls aren't going to work just in and of themselves. We have to teach people to live with integrity. Not just let them be degenerate and try to control them. Confucius emphasized that you must be able to think for yourself. You must see truths with your own eyes and be able to speak them with your own mouth and live them with your own life. Think for yourself. Do not simply adopt a dogma. Do not simply imitate others because it's been said that they are people who should be imitated. No, when your understanding of integrity says, here is a role model for integrity, then you can imitate, but you must think for yourself. Now, this is ironic because once Confucianism becomes institutionalized long after the death of Confucius, guess what? It becomes very rigid, very rule-bound, very classist, very dogmatic. And if you had a point of view that differed even slightly from the official version of the Analects, don't want to hear it. Okay? I draw a parallel to Western society. Aristotle dabbled in the sciences. Actually, he did more than dabble sometimes. But he would have been appalled to see that in medieval times, the medieval church decides Aristotle is our favorite pagan, therefore what Aristotle said, that's the last word outside of Scripture. Okay, which means no more philosophical inquiry. That would have been totally contrary to what Aristotle wanted and what Aristotle tried to do. Well, I think that the same can be said for Confucius. The later schools of Confucianism that become very rigid, very dogmatic, very intolerant of thinking for yourself, Confucius would have disowned them immediately. And I think that's true of all great creative thinkers. They taught what they taught. They did not teach an ism, which is what everybody else did, mangling what they originally taught. So a famous story about Karl Marx, that someone approached him at an international workers' conference a few years before the death of Karl Marx. If you don't know offhand who Karl Marx is, he was the co-author of the Communist Manifesto. His work Das Kapital is basically the classic text of communist political and economic theory. Well, someone approached, and basically essentially what Marx was saying was, we need to democratize the economy. We need to get rid of ruling elites. We need to democratize the economy. Well, gee, how did that work out with people who were his followers? Well, a young man approached him at this conference and asked him a question about Marxism, and Marx just waved him away and said, "Don't ask me, I'm not a Marxist." Okay? Even by that time, people calling themselves Marxists were deviating so far from the original intentions of Karl Marx, he didn't even want to be associated with it. I think, Aristotle would have been happy to say, "I'm not an Aristotelian," and Confucius would have been happy to say, "I'm not a Confucian." Okay? Okay. Above all, we need to learn to be humane. And that doesn't mean simply learning a lot of rules. That means cultivating certain relationships. What is humaneness? To love humanity is to be humane. Does Confucius tell us what he means by love or by loving humanity? No, he doesn't. He doesn't tell us in any sort of abstract or formulaic way. What he does is give us specific examples of what it is to love humanity. At home, be respectful to one another. Okay? As a former social worker, I so thoroughly endorse that. How many problems arise because people believe that within their own family unit they can be disrespectful to one another, or that respect should be enforced by, threats. You already have a chaotic, destructive situation if that's what you're doing. If people respect each other, learn by example to respect each other, if that respect is reciprocal, then that family is going to be healthy. Seriousness at work. Well, does that mean don't ever have any fun at work? No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means that you hold yourself accountable. I realize people are depending upon me to do my job. Not let me see the least work I can do without getting fired. Oh, let me see, okay, I've got this position, I'm not likely to get fired, so I'm going to goof off. Or who cares whether I'm doing a good job or not? No, seriousness at work, because you know what? You're making a contribution to society when you work. Okay? If you love humanity, you're going to care about whether you're contributing something positive. And faithfulness. Faithfulness in your relationship to other people, your friends, your relatives. Be faithful to them. Again, you're accountable. They can rely on you. You are honest. They don't have to doubt and worry that they're being manipulated or that you're about to take advantage of them. Okay. Justice combines duty and honesty. Okay. Duty to what? Well, duty is not the call to duty is not the friend of despotism. Okay. What do you have a duty to? You have a duty to justice. You have a duty to love humanity. You have a duty to behave respectfully, faithfully. That's your duty. Duty plus honesty is how we achieve justice. Confucius says in the Analects, if people are not humane, what is the use of ritual? Okay? Take your pledge to the flag, but say your prayers in church or whatever, but you know what? If your heart isn't in it, if you don't actually love humanity, what good does that do? Okay? Ritual is very, very, very important as a means of education. The reason being that we come together to enact rituals that embody our virtues, symbolically embody our virtues. It's a sort of an artistic performance, if you will, of what it is to live with wisdom, to live in harmony, to value one another, to value our ancestors. Okay? The person who is actually able to live justly, who actually deeply, unequivocally loves humanity, is a sage, a superior person. It's sometimes called a superior person, but I don't like that translation because it suggests that, again, we're in a hierarchy and there are some people looking down on the others. No, the idea is to bring us all up, a rising tide that raises all boats. The sage has the mandate of heaven. Mandate of heaven, well, that's not like an Old Testament king being anointed by God to rule. Mandate of heaven means you are living with justice. You are living with integrity. You are living with honesty. You are living with a love for humanity, with mutual respect, with empathy for others. If you're doing that, then you have the mandate of heaven. Heaven in the sense it's translated as heaven, but if you remember from the I Ching lecture, I talked about this as a sense of the cosmic order. You are in harmony with that great cosmic order that the I Ching tries to tell us about. If you are in harmony with that, that is where your ability to rule and the justification for your rule comes from. Confucius had said that if you have empathy and respect, that is enough to begin building a civilization. To the extent that empathy and respect disappear from your relationships, civilization will begin to fall. That's exactly what Miss Manners was talking about in that example that I used before. Yeah, if we don't care about each other's feelings, we don't regard other people as having feelings, or if we know they have feelings but we don't care about them, guess what? Human relations start to fall apart. If human relations fall apart, everything else falls apart. And then we sit back and wonder, what's wrong? Well, are you living with empathy and respect? Maybe you should look to the individual, okay? Beginning with yourself. And also think of embodying that in the groups to which you belong. There's a notion in contemporary Western ethics called the expanding circle that is very, very, very similar to an idea from Confucianism, from all kinds of non-Western thought, all kinds of indigenous peoples. The idea is that you learn as a small child the building blocks of relationships within your family, within your primary caregivers. Once you have learned those basic building blocks of relationships, you expand that. The circle spirals out, okay? My initial caregivers spirals out to my whole family, to my extended family, to my community, to the non-human world, to my ancestors, to the celestial realm. What's happening? I'm taking what I've learned about being faithful, being respectful, being empathetic, and I'm increasing the range of that which I am able to love humanely. The person who is in this process is becoming a sage. Did Confucius ever say anyone was a sage? He said definitely that he did not consider himself a sage. Someone said, I have heard of someone living in a Western land who many consider to be a sage, and Confucius said, since I've not met him and don't know him personally, I couldn't make any judgment about whether he's probably a sage. Okay? There's some speculation, this is a thin ice, but some speculation that there was reports of the Buddha, but that's kind of actually irrelevant. The story is what the story is. I am not about judging other people or whether they are sages. I am about being more like a sage myself. And has anybody really perfectly, in my experience, embodied this? No. So we all are in need of continuing to learn and continuing to grow and continuing to expand that circle. And it does include ancestors. A part of this is that everything I have that is good, I owe to someone who lived before me and who achieved things, who was serious in work, who was respectful in the home, who created a better life, which I inherited. Okay? In Tibet, there's a proverbial admonition to never do anything to the natural world without thinking ahead 8 generations. Okay, well, I could catch all the fish in this lake, but 8 generations later, what's that going to do? I can cut down all these trees and make a lot of money, but guess what? All the erosion that will come because of that, 8 generations later, what is that going to do? There is something very similar in this thought. Somebody 8 generations before me was thinking about living a proper life, and that's why things aren't way worse than they are. That's why I have the things that are good and worth having in this life. They are honorable ancestors. And in honoring them, I acknowledge with gratitude the virtues that they embodied. And it also encourages me. 8 generations from now, will my descendants look back and say that I was an honorable ancestor? Or will they look back, and this is I think, a very poignant consideration for my generation, will they look back and say, what on earth were you thinking of? If my life is going to embody those beneficial relationships, it helps to sort of enumerate what they are. Within the thought of Confucius, they are gen, which is mutual respect. There's a reciprocity. I treat you respectfully, you treat me respectfully. Okay? That includes both what's known as the silver rule, don't do something to someone else if it would be hurtful to you, and the golden rule, what would benefit you, be willing to do to others. That has to be based on an understanding of the true natures of things. I can't just go out and, as a simple-minded understanding of the golden rule would say, go out and just treat everybody the way I'd like to be treated, because they might not want to be treated that way. Right? You ever known someone who just hugs everybody? Well, some people want to be hugged and some people don't. You have to understand others, which means you have to be receptive, you have to be attentive, you have to be respectful, you have to be empathetic. Mutual respect, that's Jen. Chunzu, ease in integrity. What does that mean? It's like second nature for me to act with integrity. I cultivate the habit of acting with integrity so that it's not a struggle for me. Okay? It comes naturally, it comes easily. Okay? My conduct is based on mutual respect and empathy, and it is habitual. Li is etiquette. It's middle path, a golden mean. It means I have a balance between excessiveness and being timid, being too bold and too timid, between being excessive and being too parsimonious. I find that balance. Li is what all ritual, etiquette, and conduct is supposed to be based on. It's sometimes called the linchpin between heaven and earth, between the cosmic order and what we do. That linchpin holding them together is that lack of excessiveness, that balance. Or if you will, yin and yang are in balance. And qi is flowing, the life force is flowing, unencumbered and vitally. Which leads us to te, power. What is that power? Qi, the life force. That doesn't mean I win some position. It doesn't mean that I pump iron until I can, bend bars with my bare hands or whatever. This means that by living in harmony with nature, with living in harmony with one another, living in harmony with these primal relationships, the life force, qi, flows through you, unencumbered. And that's where your power comes from. It doesn't come from your ego, it doesn't come from your social position, it doesn't come from your vices. It comes from the very heart of life itself. I have a wonderful story about that. One of my teachers, Taitetse Uno, he was both a professor of religion at Smith College in Northampton and also a fully ordained Shin Buddhist priest. And one of the people who in this region of the country many decades ago got the whole ball rolling for Aikido, which is a kind of martial art. Okay? Sensei is a Japanese word for teacher. Okay? And a group of us who met on a semi-regular basis with Tai were talking to him, and people were calling him Sensei. And one of the parents said, that's going to be confusing to some of our kids to call Tai Sensei, because some of our kids are taking martial arts, and they're going to think that Tai is a martial artist. And his wife, now they're both in their mid-80s at the time this conversation is taking place. His wife excitedly says, "Oh, he is," and tells the whole story about him helping to get Aikido started. And everyone's, Tai's about this tall, and he's in his 80s. He's not a particularly big guy, right? And he says, "No, I'll demonstrate. David," I think he picked me because I was the biggest person in the room. "David, come here." I said, "Okay." He said, "Okay, move me. Take a hold of my arm and move me." So I took a hold of his arm and I tried to move him, and it's like, I don't believe this. I cannot move him. And finally I stopped and I said, okay, can you tell us how you did that? He said, I obviously couldn't overpower you with my muscles. What you learn to do is to allow the chi to flow through you and the earth. You're bigger than I am, but you can't move the whole earth. And if the chi is flowing through me, you can't move me. So that's a pretty impressive demonstration. And it's interesting as an illustration of the notion of power, te, power. Okay? And certainly there are a number of martial arts that exploit that notion of power coming from the life force, but then again, it has to be a part of your entire training of character, a whole lifestyle. You have to have all the rest of this too for that power to flow. Otherwise, you're just a tough guy. Okay, when cultural forms, music, art, literature, all the things that cultivate the mind and cultivate the spirit, those all are tools to help move you toward empathy and respect, to move you toward being more like a sage. And finally, sin, empathy itself. What does that mean? To put it in quasi-Buddhist terms, exchange self for other. You know, when we say, in our society, when we say to someone, well, how would you like it if I did that to you? There's always a kind of like an implied threat. Okay? No, this isn't like that at all. It's like you ask yourself, how would I feel if I were treated that way? How would I feel if I were thought of that way? How would I feel if I were put into this relationship that I'm putting someone else into? And then you say, is this mutual respect? Is this a love of humanity? Is this humaneness? And you make the adjustments you need to. Empathy and respect are at the very foundation of all of this. Loving humanity is not a matter of embracing some abstract principle. There's an old Peanuts comic strip in which Charlie Brown accuses Lucy. You know your problem, you don't love humanity. She's furious. She says, I do so love humanity. It's just the people I can't stand. Well, okay, there you go. Whatever abstract principle you embrace, whatever abstract principle you endorse, doesn't really matter so much as whether you embody these relationships with your life, with your thinking, your emotions, the way you treat other people, the way you conduct yourself. We'll be looking at Taoism next, and some Taoist thinkers like to say, be the same person in private and in public, which is very similar to this idea. Have integrity, have that balance. And whether you're in private or in public, you are the person who is valuing and approaching being a sage. Okay.